Come for the bread, stay for the politics. I'm Ben Walsh, and this is Let Them Eat Bread. Today, thanks for tuning in for a very special and very unusual episode of Let Them Eat Bread. Today, we are starting our two-part process on making brioche. This recipe comes from us courtesy of Claire Saffitz from her book Dessert Person. And tonight, we're going to be making our dough and getting it ready to put in the fridge. It's going to sit in the fridge for about 8 to 24 hours. And then tomorrow at noon at our normal time, we'll prepare the dough and let it rise, and chuck her in the oven. All right, so let's get started. The first thing we need to do is prepare our yeast mixture. This is going to seem a little familiar to you. So instead of water, we're actually using a 1/4 cup of whole milk. So I'm going to get my whole milk now. And we are going to have to microwave it. I'm going to be using a thermometer to temperature my whole milk, but you do not have to. Okay. Now, usually we do 30 seconds in the microwave and check it, but because we're using less liquid, we're going to start at, I would say, 10-second intervals. Now for this, you just want to make sure that it feels warm to the touch. You don't want it to be too hot. You can kill the yeast this way. So let's start. So I'm going to use an instant read thermometer to check the temperature of my milk. I suggest you do the same, but if not, the pinky test will work just fine. All right, and that's 15 seconds. It's feeling kind of warm. Let's take a look at what temperature it actually is. So this is perfect. This is just about 105 degrees. Great. So now what we're going to do, now that we've done that, is we are going to add our yeast. So go into your fridge where you keep your yeast, because yeast likes being in the fridge. It lasts longer that way. All right, and for this recipe, we're going to need just a teaspoon of yeast here. All right, so make sure there's a flat teaspoon. We don't want too much yeast. And as usual, we're just going to sprinkle our yeast on top and toss it lightly with a fork. So take your fork. Remember, we're doing an over motion like this. So just a little bit into your yeast there, just so it gets mixed in just a little bit. Now, it's not going to dissolve in the milk like would typically dissolve in the water. So just make sure that you've mixed it up. You've gotten whatever yeast you can off your fork, and then you're done with this fork, you can put it away. All right, so now we're going to cover this for 5 minutes. So set your yeast mixture aside and set a timer for 5 minutes like we're going to do right now. All right, while that's going, we're going to crack our eggs into our bowl here. We're going to use 6 whole eggs for this. They have to be room temperature. If your eggs are not room temperature, one of the things you can do to bring them to room temperature quickly is take your bowl, fill it with very hot water, probably just as hot as you can get from your sink, put your eggs in them, let them sit for a minute or two, and then they'll be room temperature. My eggs have been sitting out for about 2 hours. They're just about room temperature, so I'm going to crack these in here. Remember, we always crack against a flat surface. Sometimes we crack more than once. There we go. And we are handling eggshells, so we are going to wash our hands after this. There we go. 2 down. All right. All right, one more left. All right. So make sure that you didn't get any shell in your bowl here. And then throw out your eggshells. Now remember, now's the time we wash our hands. We'll mix our eggs in a second, but wash your hands first. And if you made a little bit of a mess, like I did, take a second and clean it up. Cleaning's always easier if you do some of it while you're actually preparing. Let's keep that here. I'm sure I'll spill again. All right, so we're just going to mix our eggs here. Just get them into a nice. You don't need to whip them so much that they have air knocked in them. You just want them to be all blended together, the yolks and the whites. All right, so now that we've done that, that's pretty mixed. Let's put that to the side. Let's put our yeast away. We're not going to need it again. All right, so the next step before our yeast is done, and we have about 2 minutes left, we might run over, but that's all right, is to put in our flour. So we are going to need, is to put in our dry ingredients, apologies. So the first thing we're going to need to do is put in 4 cups of all-purpose flour. Remember, you're going to need a little bit more flour than this for dusting throughout the process, but also just because we're going to use excess flour to dust our ball of dough in order to make it so that it's easier to rise in our bowl. All right, 1. And these should be pretty level cups of flour if you can. All right, so we've got 1 minute on our yeast there. It's all right, we'll let it go a little over. 3. And 4. That one was a little much, and I might pay the consequences of that later. But for now, let's just leave this here. Leave your whatever measure you use in there, because we're probably going to use it again to get some more flour out of here. All right, I'm going to turn this timer off. We'll check in a second once we get the rest of our dry ingredients together. The next ingredient we're going to put in is a little bit of sugar. We're going to use a 1/4 cup of sugar. Here, just pour that in. Brioche is what we call an enriched dough. It means it has sugar and eggs in it. The challah that we usually make is also an enriched dough, but instead of having sugar in it, instead of having a significant amount of sugar in it, it has honey instead. Which also allows you, by the way, if you're using a honey recipe, it allows you to put in a little bit less liquid, because honey will operate as liquid by itself. All right, so for our salt, I am using kosher salt. The recipe recommends kosher salt. As usual, table salt will suffice. I am using 2 teaspoons of kosher salt. And I'm actually using just a tiny bit less. I'm just shaking off that teaspoon measure just a little bit. You don't have to. I'm doing it just to decrease my salt content just a little bit. All right, so now if you have mixed these in a bowl as opposed to in a stand mixer bowl, you're going to take your hands and you're going to create a little well. But before that, you want to mix them together. So I'm using a stand mixer, so let's just take 30 seconds or so here and just stir these together. Combining these is obviously going to be helpful when we mix in our liquids so that everything's absorbing pretty much the same way. All right, perfect. Just shake off that a little bit. All right, so if you're using a stand mixer, a little bit of a well should have already formed. If it didn't, take your hands or a knife or a spatula and just move your flour mixture, your dry ingredients, out of the way a little bit so that your liquid ingredients have a place to go. We're just going to pour them right in the middle. And unlike when we baked the challah recipe a couple weeks ago, we're not going to have this on while we're doing it. So if you're doing this by hand, by the way, just in your bowl or on your pile on your board, just take your hands and create a little well like we did the first week. All right, so let's check our yeast mixture. All right. All right, it smells a little bit like beer. It's a tiny, tiny bit foamy. It can probably stay a little longer. So let's just keep that there for another minute or two. In the meanwhile, for the next step of this, we're going to use butter. So once we start combining this, once everything is thoroughly combined, we'll need to start adding our butter to it little bits at a time. So if you want to do this now, you can. Take a knife. So we have 2 sticks of butter, again, room temperature, and cut them into 8 or 16 pieces, kind of whatever you want. Again, I'll tell you how to do this if you're doing it by hand. By the way, if your butter is not room temperature, you forgot to take it out ahead of time, that's perfectly fine. Put it in the microwave for about 10 seconds. Again, not more than 10 seconds. Check it afterwards. Typically what happens when you put butter in the microwave for that short a time is that the middle starts to get a little soft and the outsides are still a little hard. It's going to be okay for our purposes. But if you are really worried about it, you can obviously put them in your hands, try and warm them up that way. You'll know that your butter is about room temperature when you can squeeze it with 2 fingers and create a dent. So you can see in the camera that I have created a little dent in my butter just by squeezing it with 2 fingers, and that's how we know it is room temperature. All right. This is looking all right. So it's got a little bit, you can't see it in the camera, but there's a little bit of a foam line on the outside. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pour this yeast mixture in our well. And then we're going to take our egg mixture and we're going to do the exact same. As much as possible, try and get the egg into that well in the middle. All right. Now it's time to combine. So start on a low setting. And let's do it. So this part is going to take a little while. I've got mine on the stir setting. We'll speed it up as things get progressively more held together. So while this is mixing, I'm actually just going to take the initiative here and cut up my butter. Make it easier for all of you guys at home. If you are baking this today, which hopefully you are not because it's pretty late already, but if you are, or if you want to, you can actually save the packets of butter and use these to grease your baking pans tomorrow or later today if that's when you're making it. I am not doing that, so these little packets of butter are going to get thrown out. But here you can see about tablespoon and a half size piece here. Just do the same thing with these. And your butter should cut through this pretty much like it's nothing. So your knife should cut through the butter pretty much like it's nothing. All right, so I've got 10 pieces. It says 8 pieces. Doesn't really matter that much. All right. All righty. All right, so we're going to keep on this low setting until a shaggy dough forms. It will start to do that. You'll see that there's still some parts of the flour. That aren't really moving much, but that aren't really attaching. But it will get there. So another way to know that when this is done is if your stand mixer starts to scream a little bit at you. and you can hear it doing that very shortly. I've just stopped it here to explain. So if you're doing this with your hands, you're going to do, now you've got your well either in your bowl or on your board. You're going to use the traditional method that we used in the first episode. You're just going to take your hand or your spatula or whatever it's going to be and slowly start moving some stuff into the center. And you're going to fold in your dry ingredients, and either use the 2-finger method if you're using your hands, or use a spatula to just mix it around and make sure that the ingredients are coming together. Once a rough ball of dough forms, we're gonna speed up our stand mixer. For you guys doing this with your hands, it's not going to change much for you. Just try and be a little bit more intense with it, because this is essentially your kneading as well. So my machine is giving me a little bit of pushback, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit. And continue to do this until everything is nice and combined. Again, if you're doing this with your hands, or you're doing it with a spatula and switching to your hands, you still want to just do this until everything's combined. This dough is going to get pretty soft, and once everything's combined, we'll move on to our next step. But right now, the most important thing that you can do is just to make sure that all this is combined together. All right, so my dough is coming together a little bit. I'm just going to show you real quick what it looks like. Just fold this down for a second so you can see. This out of the way. So you can see that my dough is coming together here. It's all kind of one solid mass. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take, I'm going to use my knife here. Thank you, knife, for being so versatile. And we're just going to remove our dough from our hook here just a little bit. And by the way, doing this and taking it down off the hook allows the hook to penetrate the dough in different places, which allows it to knead better, right? The more places that it can create gluten, that it can move things around, the better that your kneading is going to be. And by the way, if you're doing this by hand, same thing. You don't want to always knead the same part of the dough, knead the same side of the dough. Make sure that with each knead, once you're in the kneading process, you're rotating 90 degrees each time. You want to make sure that no matter what you're doing, you're not just going back on the same parts of the bread, because if you do, only part of your bread will actually be properly kneaded, and the rest of it will be kind of in a weird place and not properly risen. It won't rise well, so just make sure you're doing that. So we're going to go back to this real quick. For those of you who have a standing mixer, I am now on the 2 setting, the second lowest setting, and I'll tell you if and when I speed it up. So let's go back to it. And this process can take a couple of minutes. So if for some reason, it seems like it's taking a while, that's fine, don't worry about it. The end product we're looking for is soft and a supple dough, not something that kind of looks dry and shaggy like the dough I showed you a little bit that kind of looked like it would fall apart at any moment. You want a nice soft dough before we start to add our butter. And by the way, when we do add our butter, we're not only just adding fat to the equation, we're also adding a little bit of liquid that'll help us, that'll help the dough stay hydrated as it goes through its long rise, both out of the fridge and in the fridge. All right, so this is giving a little bit again. Let's turn this off. Let's try and take this down off of the thing. So you can see it's coming together a little bit. Still looks like it could fall apart if you dragged it too hard. So we're still going to keep mixing it. I am going to increase the speed a little bit here because it's not soft right now, and you'll feel it when it's ready. Right now, you should have a dough that's kind of hard and I don't want to say not very nice, but it doesn't feel like it's soft and smooth and ready for our butter yet. So the exact words that Claire uses is she says you want to keep mixing until the dough is very supple, soft, and cleanly pulls away from the sides of the bowl. It will stick to the bottom. So if it's not sticking to the bottom and it's not kind of soft and supple like that, you want to keep mixing. So we're going to get back to going. I'm going to move it up to the third speed on my standing mixer here. And you should see, by the way, when you're speeding this up, it should make an immediate difference. If you're doing this by hand, don't worry about the speeds that I'm setting. Just keep mixing that dough. It will take you longer to do this by hand. So if I'm moving faster than you, I believe you can pause me and then pick up with me when you are ready for that. And just let this dough keep moving around until it's where you want it to be. It will get there. I know it doesn't look like it, but it will get there eventually. And remember, by the way, if part of your bread is sticking to your hands or sticking to your spatula, you want to do the same thing. You always want to make sure the bread is constantly in motion and that it's constantly being stretched out, so there's good gluten development, and so your bread becomes softer and more dough-like as you continue to knead it. And by the way, if your dough looks a little small, this recipe makes 2 loaves. Don't worry about it. It's going to rise a lot in our overnight rise, and it's going to rise a lot. So this bread gets 3 rises, by the way. The first rise we're going to do, I'm not going to do it on camera, but I'll instruct you how to do it. The second rise is done in the fridge overnight. And that third rise we're going to do tomorrow, and that's when we'll do our kind of usual hour of politics that we do here as well. All right, so having some trouble getting our dough to go a little bit, but it is feeling a little better, so we're just going to push it down. We're going to push our dough hook back into it, lock ourselves in place. If you're doing this by hand, you shouldn't have this problem, but let's do it. I've reduced the speed of my standing mixer, by the way. And ordinarily, I would set a timer for something like this, like we did in our other episodes, set like certain timers for kneading and things, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to kind of wait for the dough to get where it needs to be. So if your dough is ready, mine is not, but if yours is, the next thing you want to do is you want to start adding your butter. And if you hang on, I'll show you how to do that once my dough is ready. But in the meanwhile, you want to make sure that you add your butter 1 piece at a time. And you do not, and I mean do not, add any more butter until the first butter is completely emulsified in the dough here. All right, our dough is looking a little bit better. Let's just take a look at it real quick. Let's just see what we're working with here. Starting to feel a little better. It sticks the dough hook, which is fine. Just throw a little bit. Again, we're just making sure the dough hook is getting all of it. Be patient. This is a long process. So as your dough continues to work, if you're using a standing mixer, you should start to see it start to get a little stickier. That's all right. It just means we're getting that nice gluten development that we want. And again, every so often, just reposition that dough in your mixer. Make sure that you are kneading properly. And if it gets away from you for some reason, you're having trouble, you're having trouble getting it to go, you can repeat the process of taking it out and putting it back as many times as you need to. You're not going to hurt the bread by doing this. So if every couple of turns it gets stuck somewhere that the dough hook can't get it, just move it. You can also manipulate it with your fingers if you need to. Again, same thing here. So we can see that the gluten is developing on one side and not the other, which means we need to flip it over and have our dough hook go in there instead, because clearly we're not been paying attention to our dough enough. So let's do it. Now, if you're using a standing mixer, some of your batter may end up on the side of the bowl. If so, you're just going to get yourself a spatula and you're going to knock that right down. All right, same thing, same problem. And it's actually not a problem at all, by the way. We want to make sure that our dough hook is getting everywhere it needs to. So at this point, if you're doing this by hand, you're probably about halfway done. If you're doing this in a standing mixer like this, you're having better luck than me. Again, start to add your butter, as I mentioned earlier. If not, just keep going with it. Again, you want soft, supple, and you want it to stick to the bottom of your, bowl, not the sides. All right, I'm going to increase the speed of mine again. All right, let's check our dough here. All right, so this is much more like we want. You can see it's much smoother now. It's much softer to handle. It's not sticking to my fingers as much. All right, so now, if you do have any stuck on the side of the bowl, so let me just show you my bowl real quick so I can show you what I am talking about. Come on now. Come on, don't fail me now. Ooh. Come on. There we go. So if you have some dough sticking to the side of your bowl, you can see that I do. I'm just going to get a spatula real quick and wipe this down. I suggest you do the same. Again, just typical spatula will do you just fine. Doesn't need to be covered in flour or anything. Just move it down. And if it gives you a rough time, just keep working at it. It's not stuck there forever. You can get it down. And by the way, if you don't get it all, that's fine. It's not a big deal either. You want to get most of it, but mainly you want to get the big stuff. All right, so, and we're actually going to rely on the butter to get some of this off. So I got the big pieces off. You can see there's still a little bit in there, but that's okay. So, now that we've done that, we are going to put this back on. And we are going to start adding our butter. We're going to do this very slowly. We're going to set this to kind of that low speed. That secondary speed there. All right. Use our knife here, stab one butter block, and in it goes. Now, the importance of butter being room temperature, by the way, is it will not emulse if it is not. So again, we're not adding a second piece of butter until the first piece of butter is completely emulsified. If it doesn't look like it's emulsifying at first, that's okay. It'll take some time. If you think you need to, just turn it up a little. So by the way, when your butter is fully immersed, you'll know it because the butter will be, you won't be able to see any more of your stick of butter in there. So I can still see some parts of my butter in here. So I'm just going to kind of let this keep going. Again, you're going to start to hear the slapping sound. That's okay. It's a positive sign. All right, so I can't see my first bit of butter anymore, so in goes the second piece. And this is a process, guys. This all takes a little bit of time. So don't worry about it. All right, we're gonna just knock our bread down a little bit, just because it's sticking a little bit to the dough hook. So let's just knock that down. Use your fingers if you have to. Okay. Again, you're just trying to make sure that all of this is allowing the butter to combine with it. Okay. And if your butter got stuck somewhere along the way, like the top of your container, just pick it up and slide it back in so it can re-immerse with your bread. Remember, this is a long process. This is going to take a while. If you're using a standing mixer, your mixer may get very hot. That's normal. If you're doing this with your hands, it's a little bit of a different procedure. Sorry, I didn't explain it earlier. So you're going to take a piece of butter with your hands, using two or three fingers. You're going to smear the butter across the dough. So you're going to lay your dough out flat. Then you're going to take two or three fingers. You're going to smear your butter across the dough and knead it in that way. This will be the same if you're working on a bowl. By the way, if you're on a bowl, you should be kneading on a board by now. If you're on a board, you started on a board, so you don't have to worry about it. All right, so my second stick of butter is completely disappeared. So we're going to add one more thing of butter. And I think I'm going to speed up my machine a little bit. If your dough separates into multiple pieces during this process and then recombines and does that a few times, that's perfectly fine. Just part of the kneading process. Don't worry about it. It is A-okay. And again, if your dough gets stuck, just use your spatula to move it around. Butter gets stuck, same thing. All right, so our batter's gotten a little stuck. Our dough's gotten a little stuck. Got some butter trapped up here. Just gonna push that in the center. Take our butter off. Again, if you're working with a standing mixer and your butter gets stuck, whether it's on the bread or on the dough hook or whatever, just use your spatula, move it around. So I just turned mine up to the third setting. Claire uses the word medium. So if you have a KitchenAid mixer like I do, this is going to be number 4. All right, so that bit of butter is completely gone. Let's put in our next one. So by now your dough should be starting to really come together. You'll start to see it getting much, much softer with the inclusion of the butter there. And especially if you speed it up, you'll start to see the dough separate from itself and slap around. And again, as I've said in previous weeks and even in this week, that slapping sound is inherently positive. You want to hear that. All right, my next piece of butter is ready to go in, but my dough is a little stuck. So we're just gonna improvise here. Put it down on the dough hook, add some more butter, and we're back on. Let's do it. If you're doing this by hand, your surface may get very buttery. That's okay. You'll use a bench scraper or a spatula or a knife or something to get some of that butter off later. Don't worry about it now, but use your kneading process to try and get as much of that butter in as possible. You may not be able to get all of it in perfectly okay. If you're using a standing mixer and you notice the sides of your bowl are getting quite dirty, like mine are, you can take a quick break from mixing this to scrape down the sides of your bowl. So we're going to do that as soon as this piece of butter disappears. All right, so it's disappeared now. All right, so we're gonna use our spatula here. And we've got some butter up here that's trapped. Let's get you off the dough hook, buddy. All right, let's get you off the dough hook. Yeah, let's get this off the dough hook too. This dough looks like it needs some butter loving, so let's give it some. Throw some butter on there. All right, so come on now. There we go. So you can see the sides of my bowl are quite dirty. So we're just going to take our spatula here and just down the sides, scrape down the sides. There'll be a little dough here, there'll be a little flour here. Just be patient. Brioche is a bread that requires your patience. It tests you. Which is to say, if you speed through it, you will not have very good brioche. But if you take your time and you really fight back against it, as it were, you'll have really wonderful brioche. And actually, you should notice as you are scraping it down that your dough feels really nice and soft and fluffy. And it's going to do that. But we still have a lot of butter to add. So, all right, let's try not to close that so hard next time. All right, so as I said before, our piece of butter is dissolved, so we're going to take our next piece of butter. Well, hello, stray butter. Let's see. All right, and in it goes. A little bit of stray butter here. Just try and get that. Also, if you're having trouble with your bread, and this isn't just for this episode, for any episode, if you ever have trouble with your bread, or it's not doing something, or you have a question about bread in general, or a question about politics or anything, just pop it in the chat. I'd love to hear from you, and I will answer any questions either as I see them, or during the usual hour we give to politics and questions and stuff. All right, so our next bit of butter is done. Put it in. Sorry, our last piece of butter is done. Putting our next piece of butter in. And actually, your dough will start to clean the sides of the bowl for you a little bit if you're doing this right. So just keep watching. Again, it's going to be the same way if you're doing this with your hands. It will start to clean your breadboard for you, which is very considerate of it. So just let that butter absorb. All right, perfect. Next one here. All right, we've got 2 more to go, guys. We are almost done making this bread dough. We will get there. Also, there is not going to be a politics section today. Just real quick, I thought I'd say one. I do want to comment on there was a mass shooting in California. I believe it was yesterday. My heart goes out to all the families. We really do need better gun laws in this country. About who can get it. Personally, as I said last week when I was discussing the history of gun violence and guns in America, I go back and forth on guns, whether I think people should have them or not. But the truth is, if we are going to let people have guns, we need to find a better way of regulating who can have them, and what type of measures have to be taken for people who abuse guns. Obviously, I think the shooter is going to get their due, but it's too little too late to provide justice after the shooting, when the shootings can be prevented. No other country has this problem. So we need to figure out what's going on here. And as I mentioned, there are things that we can do to make guns a safer hobby for people. I mentioned them in our last episode. I really do think change is possible. we just have to we have to put the pressure on our politicians every single time there's a mass shooting. We can't wait for the right time. When travesty strikes is the right time. We need justice, not just for the families who are victims, but also for the future families who may become victims. All right, our last piece of butter is going in. Our bowl is essentially clean. That's amazing. Keep going, guys. You should be about 3/4 of the way through your butter if you're doing this by hand. If you're doing this by hand, by the way, this will take up to half an hour. If you're doing this in a standing mixer like I am, it should take about 15 minutes, although I'm not keeping track of the time, so it's perfectly possible that it's taken a longer period of time than that. But if you're doing it by hand, just think about it's going to be about double what you're doing in the video here, unless you're really, really skilled with doing it by hand. And you just have like monster hands and just knead bread for days at high speeds. All right, so this is done. So I'm going to lift this up and just show you. Look how nice that dough looks. Look at that. So mine is a solid mass, but it's kind of weird looking. If you have a nicer solid mass, that's fine too. Let's just move this out of the way so you can see. Look at that. And that stretch is going to stick to the dough a little bit, but that's okay. I'm going to just stir it on low just so it comes together a little bit more. There we go. One mass of dough. Perfect. All right, so now here's what's going to happen. We are going to rise this for an hour, but before we do that, we have to take 2 steps. 1, we're going to flour our hands, and 2, we're going to flour our bread. So I recommend taking a little bit of your flour and just pouring it. So I have this plate here. So we're gonna put a knife over here. We're just gonna shake this out because we're gonna flour our hands. Take some of that flour, put it in your hands. This is just to make it easier to touch the dough. All right. But we're gonna dip our dough. Once we can kind of handle it into a ball, we're going to put it on here just to flour it a little bit, help it rise. All right, oh, and I'm getting flour everywhere. All right, so use your hands that are floured. Let's take this down. This dough should feel incredibly soft. No matter what I do, I'm always, come on, there we go. All right. So you can see now this dough is incredibly soft. It comes out, bowl is mostly clean. All right, this is great. It's gonna feel very buttery. Just use a little bit of flour here. We're just gonna cover it. And I'm just roughly forming it into a ball by taking my hands and just tucking the sides underneath it. You don't need to do this. It will help it rise. But you don't have to. All right, so now we're just going to dip it a little bit in flour. Right, just dip it a little bit. Wipe off the excess flour. You don't need a ton of flour on it, so just, okay, yeah, just get a little bit extra. All right, so now this is going to go in a bowl. Large kitchen bowl here. It's got enough butter on it that you actually don't need to butter your bowl. You can if you want to, but you really don't need to. So now what we're going to do, we are going to cover this. And we're going to let it rise for an hour to an hour and a half. Claire says that you should take a picture of it to see. I don't actually think you need to do that, but if you want to, that's fine too. Just take a look at it now. Imagine what it'll look like when it's doubled in size. And as usual, we're going to cover it in plastic. Or if you have the reusable stuff, I highly recommend you use the reusable stuff. I don't, which is why I just use regular old plastic wrap. Unfortunately. All right. By the way, you want to use a bowl that is safe for the fridge, that can fit in your fridge, because this is the same exact bowl that it is going to fridge in overnight. All right. So now that it's covered, get your tea towel or whatever it is you use for this. I love having a bread towel. I recommend everyone get a bread towel. It is definitely helps keep in all this nice warmth. All right, you're gonna put this somewhere warm. I'm just gonna sit it on top of my stovetop here. All right, so it's gonna sit for between an hour and an hour and a half. No matter how long you leave it, check it after an hour. You wanna make sure it doesn't overproof, but you know, if it overproves a little bit, that's fine. Just make sure it's about doubled in size. Once you do that, you're going to take your bowl, don't put your towel on it, take your towel off it. You're going to put it in your fridge. You want to sit it in the fridge for at least 8 hours, okay? Ours is going to sit a little longer because we are filming tomorrow at noon Eastern time when I will see you all to make this. This makes 2 loaves, okay? But I'm only going to show you how to make 1 loaf on the show. But if you want to make it into 2 loaves and you have 2 pans, I'll tell you how to do that at the time. I hope you enjoyed making this brioche dough with me, and I will see you tomorrow morning for the next part. Take care, everybody.